In this video, I'm going to show you a series of pictures. Some of them will require no explanation at all, and immediately upon seeing them, their disturbing backstory will be clear. The final picture, on the other hand, looks totally normal, but as I start to explain the backstory, it will become more and more horrifying, but this still won't compare to the final piece of information revealed at the end of the story. It's only then that you'll realize just how sinister this picture actually is. As always, viewer discretion is advised. This is Lena Medina. In this picture, she is roughly 5 years and 7 months old, and she is holding her newborn son. She is the youngest person to ever give birth to a child. Lena was born in Peru in 1933 in a small village in the Andes Mountains. During her childhood, her father made an honest living as a silversmith, while her mother stayed home to watch all 9 of the family's children. Lena lived an ostensibly happy and healthy childhood until the early spring of 1939, when Lena had just turned 5 years old. It was around this time that Lena's parents noticed some swelling in her stomach and worried that there might be something wrong with her. She was first taken to the local healers to see if they could determine the cause of the swelling, but the healers instructed her parents to take her to the hospital in Lima because the swelling seemed very serious. Despite how remote they were and how poor they were, wanting to ensure their child was healthy, her parents made the 350-kilometer journey from their little mountain village to the capital city of Lima. At the hospital, Lena was first diagnosed with a condition known as precocious puberty. This is when a child goes through puberty much younger than normal. This condition is mostly benign and actually fairly common, but what was rare was just how much earlier hers was than any other cases. It's also occasionally a result of a tumor, which again is usually benign, but always occurs in the brain, not in the stomach where Lena was experiencing her swelling. This is when the doctors made the horrifying realization that Lena was pregnant. And not only was she pregnant, she was 7 months pregnant. This was obviously a huge shock to everyone and obviously a horrible situation. Lena was nowhere near the age that she would be able to take care of a child, but even worse were the troubling implications of how the pregnancy occurred. 6 weeks after the initial diagnosis, on May 14, 1939, Lena's baby was delivered by C-section because her pelvis was too small to give birth normally. Shortly after that was when the haunting picture was taken of Lena holding her son. Following her son's birth, an investigation was launched to determine how the circumstances could have arisen and who the father was. First, her own father was arrested and questioned, but was released shortly after following his furious denial and the lack of evidence to support this idea. Lena was also questioned during this time, but she wasn't able to give clear and precise answers about what happened. It was almost as if she didn't quite know or understand, which suggested that she herself might not even know. Another troubling revelation was the fact that she was just 5 years and 7 months when her son was born, meaning that the incident occurred before the age of 5 years old. And unfortunately, the identity of the father has never been revealed. Later in life, Lena understandably refused to do any interviews about her story, and not much else is known about her. Her son was named after the doctor who delivered him and would go on to adopt and raise Lena and her son as siblings. It wasn't until later that her son would find out that Lena was in fact his mother and not his sister. In spite of all this, thereafter, the two of them were healthy and raised in a stable environment with the doctor and his family, and she would later go to school and get educated and worked as a secretary in the same clinic where her son was born. This helped her to provide for her and her son and later put him through school as well. Later, Lena remarried and had another son, this time in her 20s, and Lena's case has been published in medical journals worldwide as one of the earliest cases of precocious puberty in history. Apparently, she had her first menstrual cycle before the age of 1 and regularly at 2 or 3 years old. She also remains the youngest person to ever give birth. She now lives a normal life in Peru. If you're from California, you are undoubtedly aware of the state's homeless problem. Even if you're not from the state, or even from the US, you might have heard about it because of how significant it is. The weather on the West Coast is absolutely gorgeous, meaning that in some areas it never really gets cold, there's minimal rain, and the sun is almost always shining. This great weather attracts people from all across the country because it makes it really easy for people without homes and shelter to stay outside year-round. And in combination with this weather, the state's and city's policies are such that the homeless situation has become almost like nowhere else on Earth, at least in the developed world. Understandably, people are both sympathetic to the situation these people are in and frustrated by it at the same time. It can create some uncomfortable situations for the residents of these cities while also being a difficult problem to solve. So it's persisted and even worsened over the years. 39-year-old Robert was particularly sympathetic to these individuals, and as a native of California, he understood the problem intimately. Like many others, the situation was frustrating for him, and he hoped that they could get better access to food, medical care, and shelter, and really wanted to do something to raise awareness about the issue. Now, most people might be inclined to simply do some charitable work or volunteer at a shelter, but Robert had a different idea. A crazy idea, actually. As a naturally daring person, Robert came up with a stunt that he thought would spread awareness much more than any ordinary effort. But when he brought it up to his friends, they recognized the idea for what it was and dissuaded him from following through with it. The intention was good, but the execution was way too risky. It just wasn't worth taking the chance. Over the course of the next several years, Robert secretly held onto the idea and planned it and almost carried it out on a couple of occasions, only to be dissuaded again and again by his friends and family. Eventually, though, Robert had enough. He didn't care anymore. He was done listening, he needed to do it, so he packed up his stuff and went to the northeast of the country, ready to perform his stunt. You see, Robert attended and graduated from the California Stunt School, so not only was he daring, he actually had the skills to back it up, and with these skills, he planned to jet ski off of Niagara Falls in order to raise awareness for hungry homeless individuals across California, the US, and the rest of the world. Then, on October 1st, 1995, a police officer was walking along the embankment of the Horseshoe Falls side of Niagara Falls and heard the shrill sound of an engine. He whipped around and saw Robert on his jet ski just 300 feet upstream from the massive 180-foot drop. He immediately ran to the river's edge and called out to Robert and started pleading with him to turn back. Robert simply revved the engine and replied that it wasn't going to happen. The police officer then asked him why he was doing what he was doing, and Robert answered that it was to raise awareness for the homeless. Then, after replying, he turned away from the officer and gunned the jet ski directly toward the churning water at the waterfall's edge. As he sped toward it, tourists on the viewing platforms heard the sound and all turned to watch as he approached, and a few of them noticed a sign that Robert had strapped around him that said, "Feed the homeless." They also noticed that he had a weird backpack on. This was Robert's safety net. The goal of this stunt was to fly off the edge and then parachute down to the bottom and land safely far away from the falls. The crowd then watched as Robert's jet ski flew through the air and off the edge, and Robert flung his arms up into the air. This picture was taken as Robert went over the edge of Niagara Falls. For those of you just listening, it is a picture of Robert mid-air, the massive falls are in the backdrop, and Robert is separated from his jet ski. It also looks as though he has his hand on his ripcord. He then pulled this cord to activate his rocket-propelled parachute. This let out a loud bang which was audible to everyone, and they all watched as the parachute shot out and away from his body. Tragically, Robert's parachute wasn't attached to his body. He wasn't the one who had packed the parachute that morning and had no idea that this was the case. So, without any way to break his fall, Robert plunged 180 feet to the water and rocks below. This height is sufficient that even if you don't hit any rocks, hitting the water is like hitting cement. Initially, it looked as though he had survived the fall, but it was later realized that it was just the rough water giving his body the illusion of moving around. He was eventually pulled from the water by the famous tour boat, the Maid of the Mist, where he was unfortunately pronounced dead. What's the hardest you've ever worked on anything? Was it really the best effort you could have given, or simply the hardest in comparison to everything else you've accomplished? The next question is, what were the stakes involved? Was it a school thing, or a work thing, or some other personal endeavor? Were there people who depended on you, who had a vested interest in the success of the task? Maybe it was a whole team of people, or an entire company or organization. Maybe it took years of hard work and dedication and sacrifice. On the other hand, were there any of you who were thinking of a task where people's lives were at stake? I hope you were successful. Take a look at this picture. This is a doctor who just completed several hours of surgery trying to save the life of a 19-year-old who was in a terrible accident. Despite the doctor's absolute best efforts, they were unsuccessful and the patient died. For those of you just listening, it is a grainy image of a person in a white doctor's coat. They are doubled over against a cement wall in a parking lot, presumably crying. It's nighttime, the ground is wet, and despite working the hardest they've ever worked, with the highest value prize at stake, they were unsuccessful. This is one of those times where the picture says 1,000 words, and it's truly heartbreaking. According to the original post, the person who took this picture is an EMT at the same hospital as the doctor. He would later say that dealing with death and tragedy is common in their field, it's just the nature of the job, but the lives that are usually lost are old or sick or both. This is one of those ones where the patient was neither, and the circumstances were too severe and they were lost. For this doctor, it was one of those losses that really hit hard, as evidenced by the picture. Hopefully, this person was able to find peace. Take a look at this family picture. It looks totally normal, everyone is smiling, the siblings are all happy, or seem to be, and the man in the middle looks like a nice family man with a warm smile, holding a newborn baby. Unfortunately, this couldn't be further from the truth. The smile is fake, and the man is an absolute monster. His name is John Edward Robinson. John was born in Cicero, Illinois, as the third of 5 kids. His father was unfortunately an alcoholic, and his mother was quite hard on all the kids as well. With his upbringing, the way that it was, explains why he would have discipline issues almost right away, but not entirely. As a teenager, he enrolled in a private school for boys who were aspiring priests, but was kicked out of the school after only a year because of his misbehavior. Then in 1961, at the age of 18, John enrolled in college to become a radiographer, but because of some delusions of grandeur, told everyone that he was training to become a doctor. This fake story came crumbling down only 2 years later when he dropped out of the radiographer program, and then just a few years later moved to Kansas City, where he married a woman named Nancy. A year later, they had their first child, and then the year after that, they had another. Then they had a set of twins in 1971, and things seemed to be turning around for John, at least outwardly. Except for the fact that in between the birth of his second child and his twins, he was arrested for embezzling $33,000 from the doctor's office where he was working as a radiologist on forged credentials. Following his arrest, he was sentenced to 3 years of probation, which he quickly violated the following year when he embezzled even more money from the insurance company he was working for at the time. This resulted in an extension to his probation, which was not nearly incentive enough for him to stop because just a few years later, he was arrested again for securities fraud and mail fraud in his fake medical consulting company. Amazingly, despite this series of arrests, during the same time frame, he managed to become a scoutmaster, a Little League baseball coach, and a Sunday school teacher, and was named to the board of directors of a local charity. At this charity, he forged letters to the mayor of Kansas City and from the mayor to some of the civic leaders and managed to get himself named as the organization's Man of the Year. All of this was fraudulent, of course, but promptly held an award dinner in his own honor for this fraudulent title. It's not entirely clear how he managed to keep this whole ruse going because he was arrested again 2 years later in 1979, once again for embezzlement and check forgery. This time, he managed to receive a whole 60 days in jail. Following his release, he went right back to scamming people and formed a fake hydroponics business. He then presented a friend of his with an incredible investment opportunity in this business, which was guaranteed to yield a huge return on his investment. The worst part about this was that the friend really hoped that this would work out because he desperately needed the money to pay for his dying wife's medical bills. Tragically, this man would never see a dime of that money again, and as for John, he never felt any remorse for any of this because he was actually a psychopath, and it wouldn't take long before these relatively small crimes turned into much more serious and brutal offenses. A couple of years later, in 1984, John established 2 more fake companies and hired a 19-year-old named Paula to work as a sales rep. He made the job seem really enticing and told her she'd first need to go away for training. Then, when she accepted and told her family about the training, she simply disappeared and was never heard from or seen again. A couple of weeks later, after not receiving any response from Paula, her family filed a missing persons report and the police questioned John. John obviously denied knowing anything about it, and then just a couple of days later, her parents received a typed letter in the mail claiming that she was okay but she had run away, and at the bottom of this letter was her signature. Unfortunately, because she was of legal age, the police couldn't do anything about it, and the investigation was closed. A couple of years later, in 1987, John hired another woman named Catherine who had just moved from Texas to Kansas City to find work. Just like Paula, he made the job seem very appealing by promising her the ability to travel in an entirely new wardrobe. But just like Paula, Catherine disappeared in June of that year and was never seen again. Later that year, John was convicted of several more cases of fraud and landed in prison for the first time. He would actually serve 2 separate sentences between 1987 and 1993, and during his second sentence, he met 49-year-old prison librarian Beverly. While he was incarcerated, the 2 of them developed a relationship, and so as soon as he was released, he convinced Beverly to quit her job and move to Kansas City to work for him. He then somehow managed to get her alimony checks forwarded to a P.O. box of his shortly before she disappeared entirely and was never seen or heard from again. Around this same time, the internet was becoming more and more popular, and John discovered internet chat rooms. In particular, John frequented chat rooms looking for women who enjoyed playing a submissive character. He even adopted the pseudonym Slave Master in these chat rooms, where he would slowly become well known in the community. One of the first women he met in these chat rooms was a 45-year-old named Sheila, who had a 15-year-old daughter named Debbie, who was wheelchair-bound with spinal bifida. Instead of playing a domineering role, he claimed that he was a wealthy businessman and philanthropist and offered her a job. He made the job seem very enticing and offered to pay for Debbie's medical expenses on top of a good salary. The mother and daughter moved to Kansas City in 1994, but just like all the others, disappeared shortly after, and John continued to collect Sheila's pension checks for almost a decade after her disappearance. Several more years later, in 1999, John was becoming more brazen and offered both a job and a bondage relationship to a 21-year-old Polish immigrant named Isabel. The two of them met in one of the chat rooms dedicated to this type of activity, and shortly afterward, she moved to Kansas City, where the two of them were then married. And this was despite the fact that he was still legally married to Nancy. In addition to their quick and strange marriage, Isabella also signed a 115-item slave contract, which essentially gave John full control over her entire life. This included bank accounts, medical records, and some much more disturbing items as well. Of course, this wouldn't last long because only a few months after they were married, Isabella disappeared and was never seen again. The final relationship that John was involved in before he was eventually caught was a woman named Suzette, who entered a relationship similar to the arrangement John had with Isabella. She agreed to come to travel the world with him and also be a slave, willing to do whatever he wanted. And once again, shortly after she moved from her mother's house, she was never seen or heard from again, apart from some letters that she apparently wrote, which also happened to be postmarked from Kansas, despite the letter claiming they were abroad. By 1999, when Suzette disappeared, John had become careless and his name had appeared in several different investigations. Police didn't have anything solid yet, but it seemed that he was related in some way. Then in the year 2000, he was arrested at his farm after two separate women filed battery charges against him. This gave police enough cause to be granted search warrants to search his house and several rented garages that he kept around the state. Following a search of these locations, 5 separate barrels were found containing the decaying corpses of 5 women he had killed over the last 2 decades. Each of them had been killed by a blow to the head with some sort of blunt instrument. John would eventually go to trial for these crimes, and during his trial, several more victims were uncovered. One of these victims was a woman named Lisa Stacy. In 1985, John met Lisa at a local women's shelter and promised her a job in Chicago, along with an apartment and daycare for her 4-month-old daughter. After convincing her, he asked her to sign several pieces of blank stock paper, likely to capture her signature, and a few days later, he contacted his brother and his brother's wife with great news. They hadn't been able to get approval for adoption despite their best efforts, but that didn't matter anymore because John had arranged for the adoption of an orphan, a 4-month-old baby whose mother had recently passed away. He then requested $5,500 in legal fees to grant the adoption and then gave Lisa's baby to his brother and sister-in-law. Despite looking official, these papers were fake and contained fake signatures from 2 lawyers and a judge. So, in this picture, the baby sitting on his lap is actually Lisa Stacy's baby. And by the time this picture was taken, Lisa was likely dead and disposed of somewhere on one of John's properties. And not only was she taken from her dead mother, he then charged his brother $5,500 for the fake adoption. By the time anyone learned the truth, baby Tiffany was already 15 years old. For his crimes, John received several life sentences and several death sentences, but refused to give police any more than they could already prove. This means that there are likely more victims that might not ever be discovered, especially with such long gaps between known victims. Thank you all so much for watching. As a reminder, there is a scary interesting subreddit for story suggestions. I'm also accepting subscriber submitted stories if you had something happen to you that you think might fit the channel. Feel free to submit those directly to the email found in the description. I'm starting to get some really crazy stories from you guys, which is awesome. Many of these are also corroborated by accompanying news stories to verify their authenticity, which is nice. Once again, thank you so much for watching, and hopefully I will see you in the next one.